Hey everyone, welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I'm your host, Ari Whitten, and today I am with Katie Wells, who is the owner and operator, CEO, founder of Wellness Mama, which is one of the top health blogs on the internet. It's devoted to helping families and mothers stay healthy and get healthy and be energetic, which is what we're all about here. So this is a unique conversation, one I haven't had before on the podcast. And I'm really excited to talk to you. So welcome, Katie. It's really a pleasure and an honor to have you on.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. You are actually the reason that I pretty much gave up caffeine and now just cycle it versus drinking it every day. So I'm a huge fan of your work as well.
Nice. Thank you. So this is a topic near and dear to my heart, especially now because I have a 16-month-old son. So I'm a new dad, and my wife is a new mom. And so we're navigating this whole parenthood thing. And so there's a bunch of parenthood questions I have for you that I know a lot of my listeners also want to get the answers to. And also just navigating life with a family and with the stress of having children and the sleep deprivation. I mean, there's so much to talk about here and so much as it relates to energy levels and health more broadly. But I would love to talk about your story of how you became Wellness Mama. And so I'd love to just hear about how that happened, because you've been around a really long time. I actually remember years and years ago, I don't know how many years ago, but I remember like reading articles on your site and my wife geeking out about recipes and, do-it-yourself deodorant stuff and do-it-yourself cleaning stuff. And, I've been watching your work for so long. So how did this start for you? How did you actually become Wellness Mama?
Yeah, it has been a long time. I realized the other day we've passed the 10-year mark, which is wild to think about. It's been an amazing journey. But for me, it started, I think, the way it does for a lot of people who get into health, which is with having your own health crisis. They say jokingly but seriously, that most people go into psychology to try to figure out what's wrong with themselves. And I think a lot of people go into health for the same reason. Yeah. And that was certainly the case for me. So basically, if you go way back, I've always been super type A, pushed myself to the max. In high school was in like 26 activities and extracurriculars and had to have a 4.0 and didn't sleep. And that got worse in college. I think my worst semester, I had like 26 or 28 hours of classes plus activities that I was in. Plus I was dating my husband at the time. So I was like driving overnight to see him some days and then just eating cafeteria food on the run, like cafeteria sushi in between classes. And turns out those are all the perfect ways to create autoimmune disease. If you want one, you just super stress yourself out, never sleep, eat crappy food. It's kind of a perfect storm. So I knew something wasn't right. But also, like you probably have experienced, or maybe not in your case, but when it's just you, it's always a little bit harder to get the motivation to figure out how to fix it. But once I got pregnant with my first son, I got this really intense motivation to want to be as healthy as possible and to figure out what was wrong with me so that I could be the best for him. And it was actually when he was 6 weeks old, I was sitting in the doctor's office for my follow-up appointment. And I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but doctors tend to take forever to actually get you in the office. And so I had been sitting there for a long, long time. And I was reading through pretty much every magazine there. And the last one I picked up was Time magazine. And I flipped through to an article that said, and the opening line was that for the first time in 2 centuries, the current generation of American children will have a shorter life expectancy than their parents. Yeah. And at the time, I'm nursing this perfect 6-week-old baby. And it just was such a striking moment for me to realize like his perfect tiny body and that all these statistics of what they're predicting for our kids. And I've also always been the personality type of like, if you tell me I can't do something or whatever, I'm kind of like, hold my beer, I'm going to do it. And so that moment I was like, okay, my health issues even aside, like this is not happening to my child. This is not happening to any of these children. This is ridiculous. And so I got this lofty idea that I was going to somehow figure out my own health, figure out how to fix that and help all these moms to change that for their kids. And it was a very slow process. It took years of me trying to figure out myself for one, and also just writing like very small baby steps for moms, because moms are some of the busiest people on the planet. So it's not like we have time for like a 150-step comprehensive plan. We need like little things that we can implement. And so I just started writing at the recommendation of my husband, who was a tech early adopter and who designed websites. So I started writing, and just the community kind of sprung up. And I realized there were a lot of moms that were in that similar situation, like struggling with something on their own health probably, and also really wanting to be the best they could for their kids and to do the best they could for their kids. So that's kind of how it all began. And I'm so grateful now that it's an amazing community that's so much beyond me. There's a lot of moms who would consider themselves wellness mamas. And I love that. And I love that like there's millions of moms who are doing this across the country for their own families. And that's what makes it so amazing. And I'm so glad to be a part of the community, not just to be the original wellness mama.
Yeah. You know, the impression I get is almost that you've started a whole trend of wellness, like, I don't want to say wellness mama, but mommy health bloggers. And like, there's a whole like bunch of mommy health bloggers now, and there's like a community of, I'm even aware of, I heard recently that I forget who told me this, but there's like a mastermind group of mommy health bloggers where like a bunch of you guys get together and talk about things and connect with each other. And that's, I get the impression that you're kind of the original of all of those people.
Well, I think I'd like to hope at least I contributed to it. There were a lot of other voices too, and I think all of us together. And I think that that's the amazing unifying factor. You know, there's so many divisive things in today's world, and I think all of us as parents, moms and dads, can get behind the idea of wanting to leave a better world for our kids. And as a friend of mine also says, also leave better kids for our world. That's an important two-part thing. Yeah,
beautiful. So I'm curious, on a personal note, how has your health improved over, you know, since you originally started Wellness Mama? Have you seen big improvements as a result of your journey into this whole health realm?
Yeah, absolutely. It took me 8 doctors and 7 years to actually finally get to the bottom of what was going on with me, which was Hashimoto's. And after finding amazing doctors and working with great practitioners, I finally am able to say that's in remission.
Nice.
And I'm still not quite to that level. I feel like I'm still a overworking addict. And I would admit, like Overworkers Anonymous, that I work too much and I sleep too little. And I think stress and sleep are the nemesis for a lot of us. So those, I'm still very much admittedly a work in progress. But as far as my numbers, my blood levels, all of that is perfect. And thanks to people like you, I have tons of energy, which is awesome, even when I don't drink coffee like most days. So I've seen huge improvements. And more importantly, I've seen my kids skip a lot of the stuff that I thought was just part of normal childhood. Like by the time I was 5 years old, I had been on antibiotics. I can't even remember how many dozens of times because of strep. And I had, at 5 years old, my tonsils out and adenoids out and tubes. And pretty much like a lot of my early childhood memories were being like held down for blood tests and stuff. And I didn't know what was going on, and getting ear infections and just all of it. And none of my kids have been on antibiotics, and they never had something we couldn't deal with at home. And they never had really serious illness of any kind, which I'm so grateful for. But I also think it's largely from the very beginning, we were doing the best we could to provide them with a solid foundation. And I love that there are so many parents doing that. Like I really do have hope that we're going to reverse that statistic.
Awesome. So there's so many different things I think we could talk about. And I actually even reached out to my Energy Blueprint members and got a bunch of questions from individuals after I told them that I was going to be interviewing you. I specifically wanted to reach out to moms in the group and ask for what questions I should ask. So we'll get into that. But one question I have still on your personal health issues, I'm curious what types of things you found most helpful for Hashimoto's just in this process of 8 years, or was it 7 years or 8 years? 8 doctors, 7 years.
Yep. Yeah.
And just over that process of getting into remission, what kinds of things were the biggest needle movers for you?
Yeah, so I'll go through all of them. I will say though, to preface, I think, and I think you'd agree, that there's such a personalized and variability aspect to this. So like, I'm happy to share what worked for me, but I think at the end of the day, what actually worked for me was experimenting with a ton of things, a ton of ideas from really brilliant people, and figuring out which ones were my needle movers.
Yeah.
So I like to say that for other moms, because I did a lot of things that were supposed to work that didn't work for me. And I tried a lot of things that weren't supposed to be good for thyroid patients that were awesome. So I'll just start with that. So early on, like just knowing I thought I had a thyroid issue, for instance, I would start taking iodine because that was the recommendation at the time. Turns out if you have Hashimoto's, that is really actually can be really problematic to take too much iodine. So that was a definite not helpful thing. I did the autoimmune paleo protocol for a while just to kind of gauge what my sensitivity was to a lot of different foods. And so now I was pretty good at figuring out what I wasn't handling well. And now, ironically, there's tests like Biome that just can kind of tell you that right away, which I wish we'd had back then. But really just dialing in my diet. And it wasn't even so much being able to follow any protocol, but just doing the elimination diet and then introducing and seeing how my own body responded. And thankfully, I've been able to add most foods back in. I still don't do great with gluten, and I pretty much avoid that. I don't do most processed dairy, but I will occasionally, drink wine and eat cheese with my husband once in a while for a date night. I think it's also moderation is a key, but also things like eating tons of vegetables. I think it's easy to think of like taking away all the bad things, but also it really helped me to shift the focus to adding in the good stuff and keeping that the focus. So in any given meal, my plate will be like 90% green veggies. And I think that's something, whether you're paleo, vegan, whatever, we can all agree vegetables are good for you. And
I think that's the one thing, one thing that pretty much all nutrition experts can agree on, but I think it's the only one.
Exactly. Even the keto people say like green veggies are cool. And so I think that's a great place to start. And that's something we do as a family, not just me, but we all eat a lot of vegetables. A tip for moms, like we don't start out in the morning with like even bacon and eggs. We start out with like a huge vegetable scramble and we'll add protein in, and just starting the day with that kind of sustenance and all those micronutrients is a huge energy boost, more than coffee used to give me. So back to your
100%.
Yeah. So that's been huge. Also, they say fasting is not good for thyroid patients. And so I was really curious to test that because there are so many benefits of fasting, from the autophagy, and they say even like stem cell reproduction at certain levels and just the mental clarity. And so I was like, well, I'm going to test it, and I'm going to do my blood levels before and after. I'm going to monitor my thyroid levels throughout any fasting protocol, and I'm going to watch my ketones and my glucose, and then follow up with tests after and make sure I'm not seeing any decline. And for me, fasting was amazing, and not only like skyrocketed my energy and gave me great mental clarity, helped me lose weight, but also my thyroid numbers stayed perfect. So I think it's, again, back to like experimenting what works for you. And a lot of moms, it's not going to be the silver bullet it was for me at all. And a lot of people can't fast like that, and that's great. But that was for me something that was really helpful.
Yeah, very interesting to hear you say that. Fasting is one of these kind of tricky areas because on the one hand, you'll hear a lot of warnings of contraindications for people with various diseases. But actually, if you can get beyond that, fasting may actually be one of the most helpful things for even many of the diseases that you find people kind of warning against. Like, hey, maybe if you have so-and-so condition, be careful with fasting. But a lot of this is just because like a lot of it's honestly like legal stuff. Like you just got to protect yourself from making claims that could potentially be harmful. But so in many cases, it's those people with those conditions who maybe stand to benefit the most, rather than the person who's already quite healthy.
Right. And exactly. And also, like, I finally just had to think about it logically. Like, we have more thyroid problems now than we've ever had. Mm-hmm. We eat more now and more often than we ever have. Like they say, people think they eat 3 meals a day, but we actually eat like 17 to 18 times a day, because every time we put almonds in our mouth or drink tea that has cream in it or whatever it is, it's technically a digestive event. And just realizing, like, people throughout history haven't had access to food 3 times a day, and every major religion includes fasting in some form. So maybe is at least worth experimenting with. Yeah.
And they haven't had that kind of consistent access to food, at least not consistently every day. Maybe some days you were grazing all day, and then maybe other days you were fasting all day. But this era where you have constant food availability, there's even research to show that people basically consume food almost throughout their entire waking hours. Like almost the only hours that people are not eating in the majority of cases are the hours they're actually in bed. And there's been research by a researcher, it's an Indian name, Satchitananda Panda.
I've read his stuff. Brilliant guy.
Yeah. And he's done some time-restricted feeding interventions that have shown remarkable benefits. But let's dig into some of the specifics here of mommying and kind of some of the unique challenges that arise there. One is just being short on time. When you have a kid or multiple kids, there's just constant demands on you. I mean, I didn't really understand this until I became a parent myself. Like I was like, oh yeah, people are exaggerating. But now having a son myself, I'm like, no, like it's really like a constant thing. You have to pay attention to your kid almost at every moment, at least during certain ages. So what do you do when you're trying to balance the time demands with also cooking and like making healthy food and not resorting to eating, processed, pre-prepared junky stuff. And I guess there's two parts of this, maybe cooking and meal planning. And I don't know if you want to treat those as two different subjects or kind of integrate them, but do you have any tips around cooking and meal planning for moms and parents?
Yes, absolutely. And I will say it does get easier when they're older than 16 months. Like my older four are pretty self-sufficient completely at this point. But for me, what I realized was, like you said, moms have so much on their plates, parents in general, we have so much on our plates, and it's all like the stress of trying to figure it out. So for me in the beginning, when I had 3 kids in 3 years, they were all 3 and under, I was a little bit stressed to say the least. And I had to take a step back and go, okay, my stress is not actually originating from any single event like feeding my children or bathing them or meal planning. It's from the fact that all of this is on my plate. And that there's been great articles written how moms have all this emotional responsibility basically for the family. So even when we're not doing something, we're thinking about like what size clothes do the kids need? And do we need to get the next season's closing out? And are their shoes getting too small? And what about school and homework? And all of that is just in our brain all the time. So I took a step back and thought, how can I reduce that, the emotional responsibility stress? Because the physical things have to happen. We have to feed our children. And to me, it's a non-negotiable that I have to feed them real food, and they have to get enough sleep, and I have to keep a reasonably clean house. It doesn't get perfect most days, but it's reasonably clean. Things like that, they have to happen. So how can I reduce the stress? And I've always been a checklist and systems person. So for me, this meant putting systems in place where I knew like laundry happened on certain days, and I didn't have to think about the laundry when it wasn't those days. It wasn't taking up any mental bandwidth whatsoever. Now with older kids, they actually all do their own laundry, and the babies get thrown in. So that has taken a huge.
That's the processes and systems. You enlist the kids in the processes and systems.
Right. And I think that's a huge key, especially when it comes to real food and meal planning. I found, and I know a lot of moms would echo this, the more you get the kids involved at every level of that, the more likely they're going to be, for one, to eat the healthy foods. But also, as they get older, they truly can prepare meals and be helpful. So there's an awesome course called Kids Cook Real Food. And we did that with our kids. And now our older ones are completely capable of making a meal from scratch. And they love the ownership of that and that they get to help. But that hasn't always been the case either. And I realize most moms are not starting from a place where your kids are cooking dinner yet. So for me, meal planning was huge. I have an app that I use on my phone that lets me meal plan everything and grocery shop. That way I can, back to the whole mental and emotional bandwidth, I only have to shop once a week. And I can pre-make most of the food once a week, including things like I will pre-chop tons of vegetables and fruits and just have those in metal containers in the fridge. So then when lunch is pretty much always a huge salad at our house with some kind of protein and good fats, I just take everything out and throw it on a plate. There's no thought there.
Nice.
Same thing with breakfast and the scramble of vegetables, we just cook in a pan, just take them out and dump them in. So that gets the mental stress of 2 meals completely out of the way. Yeah. And then that just leaves dinner. And we just have rotating plans that are recipes I know how to cook without having to look them up. And they rotate by seasonal vegetables. So they're easy, like usually 30-minute or less meals that can be made in one pan. And I could pre-prep most of it. So I'm not spending all day cooking. Because, I mean, as you know, to eat healthy food, you literally could spend your whole life cooking if you try.
Yeah, it can be remarkably time consuming for sure. Yeah, beautiful. So, kind of a follow-up in a similar vein to that, just kind of the demands on you, time demands of being a parent. How do you stay stress-free? How do you mitigate psychological and emotional stress and make time for de-stressing and just stay calm in the midst of what must, I have one kid. I can only imagine what it's like to have, what do you have, 5 or 6 kids?
6, yeah.
Wow. I mean, I can only imagine the maelstrom of having that many kids around and just the chaos of that and the time demands of it. How do you stay calm and mitigate stress?
Not perfectly every day, but I've definitely something I've improved on the last few years. And part of it goes back to the systems, just not having that become a stress in the first place. But also, kids fight and there's chaos and noise and things don't get done in time or dishes get broken. So things inevitably happen that lead to stress. And for me, it's been a very slow process of realizing I have to schedule in time for myself to recharge, or else I do hit that wall and just am emotionally done. And that's not a place I want to be with my kids. So Sometimes that's things like we have a small sauna in our house. So I'll just sauna, which has a ton of benefits. And I know they've written about the heat shock proteins and how they affect your body positively. So sometimes it's physical things like that. The biggest ones, honestly, that keep me really grounded, that really help are, it's a non-negotiable that I get sunshine every day. I go outside. Even if it's cloudy, you still get more sunshine than you do inside. So I spend at least half an hour outside, no matter what period, either just reading in the sun, walking, something. I'm outside every day.
Do you have a specific time that you do that, like time of day that's your sunshine routine?
In the morning. And I usually try to make it homeschool recess whenever we take a break for recess and go outside with the kids. And they have like a slack line and a ninja line, which is like crazy monkey bars where they're hanging upside down and stuff, and a trampoline. So we'll all go out there and jump on the trampoline or try to balance on the slack line or just things like that. So it's also bonding time, usually with the family, or even if it's just my husband and I sipping tea while the kids play or whatever it may be. That'll be usually in the morning. And also in the morning, we try to, this was a recommendation of a friend as well, since we homeschool, but even if you don't homeschool, you could do this. During breakfast, we watched 3 TED Talks as a family. And the logic behind this that our friend explained was that kids naturally can connect dots and they're so much more creative than we are. So if they're watching TED Talks, assuming they're child appropriate, they're getting basically someone's entire career, like the best of the best, their entire career distilled down in like 15 minutes. And if you watch 3 unrelated TED Talks, kids are going to naturally start to try to like relate those things in their head because it's what kids do. And so they're going to be relating like robotics and emotional intelligence and why there's plastic in the water. And maybe one day that'll yield them connecting those dots in a way that gets the plastic out of the water. Things like that. So then we do that, and it takes about half an hour, 45 minutes, depending on that. So while we're eating breakfast.
I love that.
Then we talk about it. So that and our family gratitude practice of saying what we're grateful for first thing in the morning. It's simple stuff that we instituted really for our kids, but it's amazing how profound it's been for us as adults too, just to start the day with that, with the mental clarity, the gratitude, and the family time. Yeah,
that's beautiful. I'm gonna steal some of that routine from you. Well, when my son's able to understand TED Talks, maybe in a couple of years. So homeschooling, you mentioned that you're homeschooling, as if the stress of kids is not already enough and having them around constantly is not already so time demanding. You're also homeschooling. I'm curious what made you make that decision and how it's going, what your feeling is about homeschooling. Do you love it? Do you hate it? Do you wish you did something different?
Most days I love it. It has its moments where any aspect of parenting, I don't love it. But for the most part, I really do love it. And I will say, I think parents who have kids in school who are driving all over, they have a ton of respect from me, because no matter what schooling option you choose, it comes with its own stress. And I know that also is its own kind of stress, getting kids there on time and picking them up and all the extracurriculars, because I did that as a kid. But for us, it was really just that we had very specific things we wanted to be able to impart to our children and to accomplish with them. And the schools that we have available just don't fit into that plan for us. So what I mean by that is my husband and I are both entrepreneurs, and we both come from the belief that entrepreneurs have the ability to change the world. And like I said in the beginning, I also think moms have the ability to change the world. But we wanted to raise kids who would have that mindset and who would be entering adulthood with the idea of how can I improve the world and how can I change the world. And we just felt like a lot of the school paradigm is kind of geared toward an outdated model, meaning like sit down school kind of originated during the Industrial Revolution, when we were going to need adults to be able to work a job during the day and to have an attention span that required that, and that kind of fit perfectly. But now with technology and how quickly everything's advancing, it's so difficult to even learn a skill before it changes and new information emerges. And we didn't want our kids to just be taught to like sit down and that there's a single answer for every single problem and you have to like follow the rules all the time. Certainly, yes, they should follow the laws, but we wanted to raise kids who would think outside the box. And we just felt like it would be really difficult to do that in a literal actual box, because it's in a box. So like a lot of things in life, it means we took the hard road in some ways, and it means a lot more time and stress on some days. But we've been able to kind of create that model where we're learning by discussion, and we'll go through like history, and then we'll talk about it, and we'll try to think of like alternative solutions. And just in science, it's super fun to do with homeschooling, things like that. And I think it's been amazing because their creativity hasn't shut down. And I saw that in my own childhood, and I've seen it in other children. they enter a school and their creativity kind of starts going down over time.
Yeah.
By the time they're in high school, at least from my experience, I was a machine at taking tests and I was awesome at it. Turns out taking tests is not a real life skill, and it hasn't really served me that well in my adulthood. So we're trying to impart practical physical skills. So in a given day, they're doing things like coding or learning the ukulele, or we're having discussions about history, or we're experimenting with robotics or things like that. And our hope is, we'll see how it plays out in another 7 years when our oldest graduates, that it's going to lead to the more critical thinking, outside the box thinkers who will hopefully improve some of the problems we've got in our world today. Beautiful.
I love that. So I want to dig into a couple specific parenting questions. One is, given that you're wellness mama and you put such an emphasis on eating and cook and preparing good, wholesome, whole foods, how do you keep your kids off of junk food? Because I grew up in a relatively health conscious family, but I still, when my parents were at work and I got home from school, I would, my lunch or my after school snack would be Captain Crunch cereal, like 2 bowls of Captain Crunch cereal. Or I'd go to a friend's house and they had Pop-Tarts or whatever, what are those, Hot Pockets, stuff like that. I mean, like, even growing up in a relatively health conscious family, my childhood was still filled with lots of junk food. So do you have any tips or strategies to kind of keep your kids away from that stuff?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it's sort of a 2-pronged approach. So the first part being that at home, we don't have any of it in the house, period, which makes it easy for all of us to not eat it because it doesn't exist. And we kind of have this thing with our kids where it's developed over time. We encourage them to try 1 bite of everything before they get seconds of any food that's at a given meal, but we also don't force it. Like, I've never force-fed a child food. And more often, if they truly think they don't like something, or more importantly, if they actually are not hungry, we don't force them to eat. So the kids occasionally will skip a meal if they're not hungry, or they don't like we have one that adamantly hates tuna. And so if there's tuna, he just would rather fast. But we also educate a lot about what different foods have in them and how different foods affect the body in certain ways and why we need nutrients, which is a great, it pours over into homeschooling. So that's a good hands-on lesson.
Yeah.
And so the part of it is that just having the structure at home so that it's never there and we always have good options available. That also means I don't make any different food. So if they don't like an option at a meal, they're not getting a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. It's just, that's what there is. And then the flip side, which also kind of...
And then they can choose to fast.
Right. They can just choose if they're...
Oh, I love that. Because I've seen so many kids get super picky about what they eat, and then the parents are trying to make different stuff for every kid at every meal, and it just becomes like a horrendous hassle to do that. Right. I love setting those boundaries around, here's what we have, you either eat it or you don't eat.
Exactly. It's like, it's my responsibility to cook for you and provide food, and it's your responsibility when you're hungry to eat food. Yeah. And I feel like hunger is an amazing teacher, and contrary to whatever, I don't know what caused this modern belief, kids will not in fact die if they don't eat for 3 hours. It's okay. Yes. They'll be fine. Thank you.
I cannot stand that either. It's like, people think it's neglectful if your kid doesn't eat every 3 hours or something. I'm like, relax. It's normal. Like, humans evolved to go sometimes without eating for 6 hours or 24 hours or whatever. Right. I'm not saying intentionally deprive your kids when they're hungry and asking for foods and to withhold it from them, but to just understand that it's okay not to force feed them all the time.
Right. And that's the key, is like you just said, respecting their choice. I'm never telling them not to eat. They're saying, I'm not hungry. And I'm saying, okay, it's good not to eat when you're not hungry.
Yeah.
That's good to listen to your body. And it also teaches them kind of subtle lessons. Like, we don't always just get what we want in life the second we want it. And sometimes we are presented with options that aren't the best, and we have to figure out what to do with that and things like that. But the other half of the coin, the choice side that came from my childhood, was realizing I had the 2 extremes. So on one parent side, all the relatives, it was like every party, there was 90 types of candy. And every time we went to their house, it was like fudgesicles and soda. And then the other side was these like very thin, food averse women who were like, you should never eat too much. When I was like 3, you should never eat too much because you'll get fat, or all these things. And realizing like both sides were not balanced when it came to the relationship with food. And I didn't want to create that in my kids. So I also did not want to be like the mom who said you can never eat sugar. And then when they turn 18, all they wanted to do is eat sugar. Right. So our policy is, in our house, that there's no junk ever. But when they're out somewhere, absent of an allergy, I'm not gonna be the food Nazi. I'm not gonna mandate what they can and can't eat. I'll educate them and I'll explain to them what different foods have in them and what choice they may want, or what they may want to consider when they make their choice. But I'm not going to be the mom to like dive in and keep them from eating birthday cake at a party or from eating Halloween candy. And it's interesting because I think we don't give kids enough credit. We've always just educated kind of as objectively as possible about food. And this year we moved to a new neighborhood and had the first time ever that we were really presented with the Halloween thing, because we always just skipped it. And this year, all their friends were trick-or-treating. The neighborhood does this huge party. Like, it's a really big deal. And they wanted to dress up and they wanted to hang out. And so I just like swallowed my kind of anxiety and didn't stress about it and was like, okay, well, you guys can hang out with your friends and we'll talk about it later and just have fun. And that night they all come in and it turns out none of them actually went trick-or-treating for candy. They walked around with their friends and just said no thank you to the candy. Wow. I was shocked because I knew that they understood food. But also I know it's a big temptation for kids at their ages to say no to candy. So wow. It really brought home to me, like, we don't give them enough credit sometimes.
Yeah, that's shocking. Actually, the next thing I was going to ask you, when you mentioned that you've spent a lot of time educating your kids about the nutrition and qualities of various foods, that's kind of my plan going into it. But since I haven't already done it, I wonder in the back of my mind, well, will a kid really get this? Will they really care about preventing diseases 30 years from now or extending their lifespan? Or do they just want that pleasure in the moment and they don't give a crap about whatever education you're trying to give them? So it's great to hear that it actually works.
It does. And also, if they aren't eating it at home, the few times they've tried sugar, they felt pretty bad. And that was also a great teaching opportunity, because when you've watched a TED Talk about fatty liver disease and how sugar impacts fatty liver disease, it's easy to tie that back in. And they're like, oh, so my liver doesn't feel good. Like, they can actually kind of start making those connections. And so I think, the education and the freedom to actually choose it and fail a few times are the keys there. Yeah.
Beautiful. So another parenting question, separate from food. I'm curious on your thoughts on like attachment parenting. And, it's interesting now that I've become a parent and I've read some books on different styles of parenting, and there's really pretty radically different schools of thought around things like co-sleeping versus like letting your baby cry it out when they're 3 months old, and physical touch and being there to support your baby when they're crying versus letting them kind of learn independence. I mean, it's actually crazy just to see how not on the same page we are and how there really is no consensus around this, which I think there should be. There should be like a science that says, here, based on all this body of literature, we know that this is the right thing to do. But there isn't. We just have these radically divergent schools of thought on parenting and all this sort of sleep training and so on. So I'm curious what your personal philosophies and what direction you went as far as attachment parenting versus, I forget what they call the opposite of attachment parenting, but I guess neglectful parenting. No.
I'll try to tackle it with the most respect to, because there are certainly definite different viewpoints. And I feel like I should say to begin with, because anytime you get into these issues, like what we chose is in no way a judgment of what anyone else chooses. And me choosing these things, I'm not putting down anyone who chooses differently. I will say we've never had these mythical babies that I hear about that just sleep through the night at like 3 months old that you hear about. I have a friend who has one of those and I'm like, wow, I don't even understand. We've always had very active babies from a very young age, and they did not love to sleep. So I kind of had to figure out that balance for myself. And I think I agree with certain aspects of attachment parenting. For instance, you can't spoil a baby. It's physically not possible to love a baby too much, hold them too much, hug them, any of that. And before about 6 months, I agree with the whole not letting them scream and cry. Personally, just that's what's worked for us. So we have slept with ours in the bed for the first 4 to 6 months, just because with other kids, that was the only way I got enough sleep. If I was like up sitting in a rocking chair all night nursing the baby, our kids like to eat like every hour and a half to 2 hours. So it was either they were in our bed or I didn't sleep for 6 months.
Yeah.
But after that, we start transitioning them into thinking of them as children, not babies. And it's a slow transition, but kind of tied in with our homeschooling idea is we want to raise adults. We don't want to raise children. And I don't want to raise adults who, when they get into adulthood, are like some kids that I've heard recently where they're having to take adulting classes because they don't know how to fold laundry or operate an iron or cook food. So that part of the process, we try to evaluate. One of our core things is we're not going to do anything for a child that they're capable of doing themselves. And that includes doing their laundry. So our 4-year-old does her own laundry. She's ruined a few shirts, but she does her own laundry. Things like that. Like I don't tie their shoes once they're capable of tying their shoes. And I don't get them dressed once they're capable of getting themselves dressed. And so part of that is when they psychologically are able to start sleeping, for the health of the whole family, I help them do that. And I'm not one to ever just like put them in their bed and let them scream all night, but I will transition them to a crib when it fits for our family. And we've always just used the method of putting them in there, soothing them, staying there for a little while, leaving. If they cry, coming back in, soothing them, but not picking them up, just reassuring them, we're here, we love you, we'll pick you up in the morning. And it usually takes like 2 nights of that, and they're sleeping through the night just fine. It does help that we have other kids, so they're never alone in the room by themselves. They're usually with a sibling. So that's helped. I think at the end of the day, it's a very obviously personalized thing. And all of our kids have shown independence really early. I don't know if that's because we've really tried to foster it or that's just their temperaments. But like we had one that walked at 7 months and climbed at 9 months. She crawled at like 3.5 months. It was insane.
Wow.
And if I had tried to attachment parent her and like put her in a sling at 9 months old, she would have like physically revolted and climbed out. Like It wasn't going to happen. So I think there is an aspect of each child is different. But I also think you have to, I worry a little bit with some of the more extreme versions of attachment parenting, that they don't actually take into account the family dynamic or the couple. It's all about the child. And that's something we've always thought is like, they know psychologically kids are the most secure when they know that like they're not the center of the universe and that they're part of a bigger unit, but they're not the center of it. And so we've tried to always keep the focus on like mom and dad are here, like we're the couple, we love each other. You guys are the most important visitors we're ever going to have in our house, but you're not permanent members here. Like we do want you to fly away one day. And so when something starts impacting negatively the rest of the family, we want to make sure we like figure out that balance. So long way of saying, I think it's very personal, and I think you have to find what works for your family. Yeah,
well said. So, okay, another question that I have for you, kid-specific question, and a very controversial topic is vaccines. I'm curious, and I'm sure, obviously, running Wellness Mama, you've looked into this extensively, and having 6 kids, you've had to make lots of decisions around this. I'm curious what you've arrived at, and you don't have to talk about your personal decisions that you've made, but what kinds of things have influenced your thinking on this subject?
Yeah, absolutely. So it is something we've decided. I won't publicly say what we've done until the kids are all grown, just because I feel like in a lot of aspects, that's something that isn't necessarily needs to be public knowledge, and we just feel more comfortable not saying what we personally do. Yeah, you're either way, whether you've done all the vaccinations or done none of them, you're going to attract heavy criticism from some segment of a very polarized population on this subject. So I think it's smart to not say that. Either way, you're going to be attacked severely. Right. That said, I would say probably of all the health issues, including my own thyroid condition, vaccines are probably the issue I've researched the most. And I mean, I have talked to hundreds of doctors, both in the US and out of the US, and I've talked to immunologists and PhDs and just everybody across the board and like grilled them for actual answers. And what I've come to is I think we're having the wrong conversation. I think that when everything got turned into the do vaccines cause autism question, we kind of like lost the ability to have rational conversation. And what I mean is, like they can definitively, quote unquote, prove that vaccines don't cause autism. And my theory is that like a lot of things, it's the whole bathtub effect. You hear that analogy that you can put a lot of things in a bathtub, but once it reaches the top, it's going to overflow no matter what you put in. So when it comes to more complex things like autism, I think vaccines and the things in them are one of the many things that go into the bathtub, along with whether they got probiotic exposure at birth, along with what toxins they're exposed to on a daily basis, along with sleep and genetics and everything else. And whenever for that individual it reaches a threshold, it's going to overflow. And so I think that, I think when you narrow vaccines down to one single conversation like that, you lose the ability to have a rational conversation that involves all the other things that matter. So for instance, when I was looking at the data, we know, and nobody would argue, that autoimmune disease is drastically on the rise. In the US especially, but also in other parts of the world. Like that's unquestionable. And they're tracking that in various metrics, along with a lot of other diseases. And also along with that, in the last 30 years, we've added so many new vaccines And that increase kind of matches up perfectly with the graph of autoimmune diseases on the rise. And certainly correlation does not equal causation, but there's a difference between when you're talking about the like 7 vaccines I got as a kid and the 36 that most kids get these days. If you're trying to say those are the same thing, when you're talking about like almost a 4x multiple, it doesn't work like that. You know, like there's a huge difference. And so I think we need to talk more about the autoimmunity aspect, because by the nature of vaccines, they are supposed to cause an immune reaction. That's how they work. And when we're injecting so many in such a short amount of time, and increasing that number every year, I think it's logical to at least look into the fact that maybe these are having a negative immune consequence down the road that we're not seeing till later, that doesn't show up in that 2-week window that they usually track, and it isn't mitigated by Tylenol, and that we maybe need to look deeper. And there's some fascinating research coming out of a lot of different parts of the world about this. And I will also say, I think as moms, no matter what our opinion of the issue, I think it's one area all of us can step back and like maybe take a little bit more kindness when it comes to this, because I mean, most moms approach this as a truly life or death issue. And I have seen people who had lifelong friendships never talk to each other again because of the issue of vaccines. Yeah. And at the end of the day, if you want to look at data, community and friendship is the biggest predictor of how long you're going to live and reduction in all-cause mortality.
100%.
More important than even vaccines. So if you are cutting people out of your life because they have a different opinion with you, first of all, I've always said in my life, if there's a hill you're willing to die on, you should perhaps consider that you could be wrong about it. Because when you are that adamant about something, usually it's coming from an emotional fear versus an informed reality. But also, if you're willing to cut people out of your life, family and friends, because they disagree with you, that might be something to reconsider. Yeah,
beautifully said. I completely agree with what you said, that this conversation around vaccines has become way too myopic, way too focused, specifically on autism, specifically on mercury. And on the periphery of that conversation, like you said, there's all these other things that are going on. I mean, there's actual research on aluminum in vaccines, not just mercury, but looking at that and certain neurological consequences. There is actually some data, some actual research on this that's pretty concerning. There's also, you mentioned autoimmune disease. Unbeknownst to a lot of people, there's also huge links with cancer that really people don't. And this is, I'm not just talking about one study or two study. I'm talking about literally dozens of studies that have been done showing that getting certain infections in childhood end up creating, developing the immune system in such a way that it confers protection against various types of cancer later in life as adults. And they've actually shown that getting certain vaccinations that prevent those infections increases risk of those types of cancer later in life. So, and this is not controversial, and I'm also not trying to argue for a blanket avoidance of all vaccines or anything like that. I'm with you that we need to walk this middle ground and actually understand the data. But there's really a lot of ideologues who are not aware of those things, who are not aware that there actually are lots of pieces of research of studies that have shown links that are of concern that are not directly related to this question of mercury and autism.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, exactly like you said, it's realizing on both sides that people who choose not to vaccinate don't want to infect the whole world with measles and every child die any more than those who choose to vaccinate want to forcibly inject small children with lethal doses of heavy metals. But I think you're right. I think we go to the extreme in both of those cases, and people won't even listen to the data a lot of times. So that would be my encouragement at the very least. Like, don't just say you did the research because you asked one doctor. Like, actually look at studies and actually do the research and ask the hard questions, because we owe it to our kids. No matter what side you're on, we owe that to them. Well said.
So change of topic. We'll get away from vaccines so people don't hate our guts after this. And I have a few specific questions from some of my members of the Energy Blueprint. One is from Sandra Brooks, and it's a very specific question. Hopefully you'll have some kind of answer for this. But she said, I perform a lot of outdoor chores and crafts, and my fingernails are a disaster. What can I do to improve the skin around my nails and my cuticles? And what can I do to strengthen my nails?
So twofold approach, because I've had that too. One year we had a garden that was 50 feet by 25 feet, and I was in it like hours a day, and my nails cracked because the minerals in the soil. So Two-prong approach is make sure you're getting enough healthy fats and micronutrients in your diet, which most people hopefully are. I also found that collagen and bone broth were helpful just because we know that those are good for nails. I also, though, found it helped to rub my hands with raw shea butter because it's so thick and waxy before going in the garden. And that'll stop some of the like moisture draw from the soil, drawing the moisture out of your hands. And then conversely, after you come in and clean up your hands, put shea butter back on, which is super thick. I mean, it's almost hard to rub in, but it really does protect your fingers. And if that doesn't help, try melting down shea butter with some beeswax, and the beeswax will protect from any water loss, and that helps. And you can do it at night too while you're sleeping.
Excellent. Love that. I was worried you weren't going to have an answer to that. And sure enough, you have like the best answer ever. Okay. From Kathy Thomas, she said, I've used virgin coconut oil as a base for do-it-yourself lotions and deodorants, but it's drying to my skin and it doesn't absorb. Should I be using fractionated coconut oil instead of virgin or extra virgin? What are your thoughts on do-it-yourself lotions and deodorants for people that coconut oil doesn't work well for?
It's a good question. And there does seem to be a subset of the population that just doesn't interact with coconut well, at least topically. And for that, usually those people, from what I've seen in a lot of years of answering this question in blog posts, they tend to have skin that responds much better to like either jojoba oil or olive oil. Even just olive oil is amazing for your skin. And in Mediterranean countries, they use it all the time as the base for everything. Mm-hmm. So you can absolutely substitute olive oil. It'll have a little bit of an earthy taste if you don't, or flavored. If you don't like that, put some lavender in whatever you're using. And I always say if you're going from a solid oil to a liquid oil, just reduce the quantity by a third and you should get the same consistency.
Excellent. From Jane Rosebro, she said, I would like to know if she has any wisdom or referrals about incontinence, a not too discussed common problem among women.
Yeah, interesting question. So I have a whole post. You can Google Wellness Mama Kegels and also Wellness Mama, I think, pelvic health, and it should come up. But basically, like the theory of what I've seen from talking to a lot of people is that it's not just your pelvic floor, that's what the focus is typically on, but it's actually much more of a core issue. So there's some really good programs out there that address like complete core strength and pelvic floor strength all together. And those tend to be much more effective because the lead researchers right now are saying that just Kegels on their own without any kind of actual resistance it's not going to be enough to fix the pelvic floor and to reverse incontinence. So that, I think I would start there. Sometimes there can be cases where you do actually need a physical therapist if it's a result of a traumatic birth or an injury, but a lot of times those alone will fix it. Awesome.
And last question that I have for you. Do you have any advice for new moms?
Yes, but not like a practical to-do list because new moms have enough on their plate. I would say if I could go back and tell myself as a new mom, or what I wish someone had told me, was that it's normal. Like whatever you're going through is completely normal. And it's normal if you can't take a shower every single day, and you're not a failure as a mom if the house is a mess. And if all you did is feed your baby, that's enough. And to give yourself a huge amount of grace and a break, and drink a lot of water, and don't stress, because it's so sappy and cliche to say, but it really will pass extremely quickly. And you'll wish you had slowed down and slept more and enjoyed it more versus trying to keep up with everything. Your life will change when you become a mom. You can't keep up the exact same level of everything you did before because you just won't have the same amount of time. But just give yourself some space and a break and take a little time for yourself if you can. Maybe hand baby off to dad once in a while. But just realize you're doing an amazing job. And sometimes that just means you put pants on, and that's awesome.
Beautiful. Well, Katie, this has been an absolute pleasure to have this conversation with you and get all this feedback. Thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with my audience. I know people are going to absolutely love this. And this is also super unique. I've never had a conversation like this with someone. And this is just such vital information and perspective especially for new parents and moms in particular. So thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks, Ari. It's been awesome. Thank you for having me. Yeah, take care. Hey guys, this is Ari again. And one more quick thing before you go. I just want to highly recommend that you go over to wellnessmama.com and subscribe to Katie's newsletter. Her website is just a really wonderful resource for quality information on everything from health to motherhood to do-it-yourself home cleaning supplies and do-it-yourself home beauty recipes and moisturizers. And I mean, it's just a really great resource for all kinds of health related information, and especially for parents and especially for moms in particular. So highly recommend that. And I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I'll talk to you again very soon.